about various problems and dilemmas that Chileans are facing as they're drafting their constitution. The idea is to bring together international experts from various parts of the world, along with academics, stakeholders from the Chilean context, from various political perspectives and ideologies. The forum is geared towards not only Chileans, but also to a public that goes far beyond just Chile itself. We think that the Chilean process has lessons for a lot of different other countries, such as the United States. These are co-sponsored by the Luxic Scholars Foundation and also has the support from various academic institutions from Chile, including the Public Studies Center from the University of Chile, the laboratory from University of Diego Portales, the School of Law and Political Science, and the School of Government from the Catholic University, and the Institution about Data, and the Chilean Student Association from Harvard. We also have we're very lucky to be able to have the council combined of various professors from Chile, but not only from Chilean professors, they also work in Chile. Claudia Fuentes, Claudia Ice, Juan Pablo Luna, who's not Chilean, he's from Uruguay, Cristian Rodriguez, Subcelano, and Sebastián Soto. I want to thank them for their constant help. Before presenting our keynote speaker, we're going to talk about a few logistical aspects. The event is being recorded. There is English and Spanish interpreting. So if you would like to listen to the presentations in your own language, you can go to the interpretation button in the lower part of your Zoom screen. We unfortunately do not have interpreting for people who do not understand the Spanish that I'm trying to speak now, but there shouldn't be a problem for everyone else. The third thing is that if you have questions at any moment in time, you can send them through the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen. And after the presentation, I'm going to moderate a series of questions and answers, but if you have a question at any time, you can send it. Please go ahead and do that. The event will last about 1 to 1.5 hours, or 1 hour 45 minutes as maximum. As you know, one thing is to find things in common between Chile and the United States. Both democracies are becoming more inclusive and much more diverse. In the United States, for example, the number of women in the Congress have increased by 144. There are 5 times more. It went from 22 to 144 in the Congress from when I was doing my PhD. And there are more Afro-American women and Latinos. It's 3 times larger. In Chile, the legislative body is much more diverse and representative from any other time in history in the country. So the public debate has become much more plural in nature. It's more interesting, it's more democratic, but it also generates and brings about much more tension in terms of language. Without even thinking it twice, a few decades ago, there would be resistance. The public sectors, people don't come from the same cultural space, they don't come from the same schools, they don't know each other like they used to. And as a result, the norms in the public debate are obviously changing. The old norms and standards are being questioned. And this process, it's not a surprise, has brought about certain fears that the freedom of expression could be restricted in Chile and also in the United States. And so to express these ideas, we've invited 5 panelists who for me are extraordinary people. Our keynote speaker, who will be my neighbor, Archon. Thank you to Archon. I'm the best speaker on my street. Archon, professor of citizenship and democracy in the Harvard Kennedy School, where he has taught from 1999. One of the most brilliant and influential from the United States, one of the primary forces in public and academic debates about deepening democracy and strengthening democracy, how to inform citizen participation. Archon is the co-author of 5 books, including Empowered Participation in Urban Democracy, Deepening Democracy, Institutional Innovation in Empowered Participatory Governance, and Full Disclosure, Perils and Promise of Transparency. Archon has also been a very important voice in the current public debate over the last years about how to save democracy in North America. Archon is going to speak about between 20 to 30 minutes. Then we have 4 excellent panelists who are local, who are going to speak about 10 minutes for each one. And I'm going to present them before handing over the floor to Archon. First, we have Patricio. He's the Dean of the School of Geography and Political Sciences in the Catholic University of Chile. He's a historian and has been the author of many articles among the Book of History of Free Competition in Chile. The second is my friend Paula Molina, a journalist and a co-author.
Editora general de la Cooperativa podcast.
She's the head author of a podcast and in BBC New Mundo. She's one of the best journalists that I've ever met, after my wife, of course. And she's one of the star authors in 2013, about 8 years ago. Wow, it's been 8 years. She won a prestigious award in the University of Harvard, where I was able to meet her. I had the privilege of meeting her. Then we have Chiara Saez, who's associated professor in the School of Communications and Marketing in the University of Chile. Dr. Saez is a sociologist dedicated for over 20 years to research in communications, especially issues in television, in the politics of communication. She works about freedom of expression at the University of Chile. In 2014 to 2016, she's been a member and the president of the Council of Civil Society and the Undersecretary of Telecommunications. And she's the author of 2 books, TVD Digital and Notes for the History of Communication in Chile. She's also the co-author of 2 major publications that came out this year. One is the Communication from Grassroots Communication, and the second is Informing Free Expression in Chile 2020, between the social uprising and the pandemic. She's currently preparing a book about pluralism. Thank you for accepting our invitation to speak today. And the 4th panelist will be Francisco Urbina, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Public Law in the Catholic University of Chile. He's an attorney with a PhD from the Oxford University, and he works especially in the field of human rights. He has been published broadly in Chile and abroad, and he's the author of a certain book, Proportionality and Balance, from the Cambridge University Press in 2017, and another book about legislation and human rights that also came out from Cambridge University Press in 2018. And between 2019, 20, and 21, he's been working as a legal advisor for the Chilean mission before the Organization of American States, the OAS. So then we're going to begin with Archon.
Great, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, great. And hopefully people can see my screen. Thank you very much, Steve and Marcella, and the wonderful leaders and staff of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. It's really just an honor and a privilege to be able to engage in these conversations with you today. Before we get started, I should acknowledge that the work I'm going to present here is joint work with a good friend and colleague, Joshua Cohen, who teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, and then also at Apple University. By way of full disclosure, I think that's very important in democratic conversations to reveal our potential conflicts of interest. I occasionally work at Apple University, and Apple is obviously a global technology company that is involved in the digital public sphere in many, many ways. And so it's important to disclose that. The motivation for these remarks and my interest in this conversation is very simple. We are in the middle stages of a revolution in communication technology. And the last such revolution occurred in the first part of the 20th century with the proliferation of film and radio and television. And that technological change had enormous political and democratic consequences. Many people thought that the clever use and abuse of those technologies by leaders such as Mussolini, Hitler, and Hirohito facilitated the rise of fascism. After the war in the United States and in other democracies, serious social reflection and concerted public and private action bent the arc of technology to make it more hospitable for political democracy. Now, these remarks will perhaps be a little bit more philosophical than many of the discussions either about technology or even about constitutional reform that you're engaging in. And so my question is, what is a good democracy, and what kinds of public debate and speech and expression and news and information does a good democracy require? So those are the kind of questions that I'll address this morning. These remarks are about the ideal shape of the digital public sphere, and many factors combine to produce that public sphere. Constitutional and legal provisions are essential for sure, but not the be-all end-all of creating the public sphere. It's not as if the First Amendment of the United States guaranteeing freedom of expression determines what our public sphere looks like. It's very important, but one element. There's also private sector and corporate action, government regulation, as well as the public culture of speech, as Steve was talking about in his remarks, and I'll deal with these together. Now, it is such a delight to present some of these thoughts to an audience that is engaged in studying, reflecting upon, and participating in the exciting constitutional reform process in Chile. We are at a moment of profound political, technological, and social change in many societies around the world, and the stakes of success or failure could not be higher in Chile and in many other societies. So this time around, will our societies be able to bend the arc of technological development so that they create the informational conditions for a successful democracy? Or will we continue to operate in ways that undermine or at best are indifferent to the success of democracy? I do not know whether we'll ultimately be successful in this endeavor and which societies will succeed, if any, and which will fail. But I do think that we're more likely to be successful with clearer ideas about what kind of democracy we want and what kind of constitutional and legal regimes will shape communication technology and the public sphere to support that democracy. So these remarks focus on what success in the democratic transformation of the public sphere would look like. So what do I mean by democracy? Big question. It has at least three elements for me. One is it's a democratic society. There are citizens who care about their democracy and want it to persist and are willing to take action to make it so. It requires a democratic political regime, which involves contestation and multiple parties and elections that occur from time to time and that are respected. And it's for me, I have a deeper conception than just political elections. For me, a democracy is also a deliberative democracy where citizens and groups and communities offer different ideas about what direction the society should go and make arguments and offer reasons to one another to support those ideas. I'm beginning from a two-track idea of democracy that is motivated by the work of Jürgen Habermas. For me, democracy has two important pillars. The first pillar is formal institutions, which a lot of people on this Zoom call webinar are interested in thinking about and studied for a long time. Those formal institutions include constitutions, which you are reworking, legislatures, prime ministers and presidents, parties and courts. But also there's a second important pillar that is shaped and in turn shapes the first formal pillar, and that is the informal public sphere. This is what Habermas calls track 2 in democracy. There are newspapers, radio, TV, speakers' corners, social media, lunchrooms and dinner tables, protests in public squares. And many of these remarks will focus on the shaping of the informal public sphere, which is profoundly important for the Constitution and the shape of democracy in the United States. In older times, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, the movement to allow women to vote and participate in politics are all part of the informal public sphere. More recently, since the 2008 financial crisis, there have been many public sphere movements on the street. And in Chile, I think that it's the public sphere activity in large part that created the occasion for us to talk today, both in terms of the first round of protests that created the demand for constitutional reform in the first place, and then also the later activism and referendum process that led to a more popular constitutional assembly that would have otherwise resulted and that is now in place and that we're talking about. So all of these are examples of public sphere, civil society activity. A key part of the public sphere is media and the information sphere. That is where these days many of those conversations occur. So this set of remarks has 3 parts. The first part is ideals. What does a good democracy need from its public sphere? The second part, and that's a philosophical discussion about standards and what we should be aiming for. The second part is an assessment to give you a sense of how those ideals work. So how democratic was the mass media of the 20th century, and how democratic is our current digital public sphere? And the third question is prescription. How can we make our digital public sphere better for democracy? So to the first part, what does a good democracy need from its public sphere? And this is the part that's most important for us in any society who are thinking about how to constitute the public sphere, whether it's legal elements or its constitutional elements or its private sector and civil society elements. So the main idea that I'm putting forward here is that a good democratic public sphere needs to create the conditions for equal substantive communicative freedom. Let me pause on that because it's a lot of words and I will unpack it in a minute. But the idea there is that every citizen has an equal and good opportunity to communicate his or her political ideas and views in society. And part of that is about the freedom to do so, that he or she won't get imprisoned for putting forth ideas that are unpopular or opposed to the regime. But part of it is also about substantive opportunities. How much chance does a person have to get his or her views out there into the public sphere? Both things are important. And that ideal has 2 sets of requirements. The first is a set of rights and opportunities. And you can think of these as the legal structural rights and opportunities that anybody, a politician or an ordinary citizen living in a neighborhood, enjoys or lacks. Rights and opportunities. These are about the structure of the public sphere. And the second is about norms and responsibilities. So what are the norms and obligations that participants in the public sphere have to one another? And some of those norms are norms like, I'll go into them in a moment, but norms like trying to get to the truth and not intentionally misleading. These are things that I think citizens and leaders owe to one another when they engage in the public sphere. And those 2 elements, the rights and opportunities and the norms and responsibilities, together create a healthy public sphere for democracy. So first, the norms and first the rights and opportunities. And I think there are 5 of these. Some of these can be constitutionalized, reinforced by constitutional provisions. Some cannot. The first is a right to free expression as a basic liberty. This is in many constitutions, including the Constitution of the United States. The second is not easily constitutionalized, but the second is an opportunity for equal expression, that each citizen in society has good and equal chances to express him or herself. Now, we'll go into the digital public sphere and the mass media public sphere, but when I was a graduate student, roughly the time when Steve was a graduate student, the main outlets for participating in the public sphere were controlled by media organizations and journalists like Paulina. So I was kind of a rebel, and I would spend a lot of time writing opinion pieces to various newspapers in my hometown and national press, and they would all get rejected because I wasn't a very good writer and my opinions weren't very popular. But in that environment, I had very constrained opportunities to express myself in the public sphere. These days, my opportunities are much greater. And part of that is because I'm a professor at Harvard University and I write a little bit better than I did at that point when I was a graduate student. But part of it is because the digital public sphere has happened, and I can put my ideas out there on Twitter or Facebook without people like Paulina and her editors deciding whether my letter to the editor is good enough. So my chances for expression are much greater in the current domain than they were in the mid-20th century. Now, the third requirement, right and opportunity, is a right of the listener in a democratic society. The right of a listener in democratic society is that he or she should have access to reliable and instructive information. Also, not easily fully constitutionalized, but I think that constitutional provisions can be more attentive to this requirement, this philosophical requirement, than the constitutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. And then fourth, diversity. Listeners should have good and equal chances to hear a wide range of views. And in all of our public sphere, we're hearing a wider range of views than we all have in some time, to be sure. And then finally, this is one for social movements and advocates, communicative power. Everybody should have good and equal chances to associate and explore interests and common ideas with others. And part of this is constitutionalized in many societies in terms of freedom of association, but that's just part of it. That's just one part of the right and opportunity, okay? So these are the 5 rights and opportunities that Josh Cohen and I think are important for a healthy democratic public sphere. But then we also think that the participants in a public sphere have norms and responsibilities to one another and to their democracy, okay? And there are 3 of those. And one is regard for truth. We think that participants in the public sphere need to have a high regard for truth. Truth is hard to come by. So we don't say that people only need to say true things, because even when you're trying very hard to be truthful, the world oftentimes is very resistant. So think about all of the best intended efforts to give people truthful information and advice about COVID in the early part of the pandemic. Many people were mistaken, and their views turned out not to be true, not from malice, but simply because the truth is hard to access even in the best of circumstances. But we have an obligation to be truth regarding, Josh and I believe. And some of this, just think about when you engage on social media, the minor obligation is to think about whether a statement is true or false before you retweet it or like it. And if you're a journalist or an academic or an intellectual, then or a political leader, the burden is greater because you have a greater access to have your views heard, and you need to be sure that as best you can, what you're saying is true. Second is a common good orientation, is that when people are speaking, they should be trying to speak, especially about political ideas, in ways that that take the common good, that is what other people, even people who disagree with you, have an interest in. And then the third norm is civility, not in the sense that people should be polite or nice to one another, although that would be good. Here, civility means that people have an affirmative responsibility to explain themselves to one another in the public sphere and why they're favoring the politicians or the parties or the policies or the visions that they have for society. Okay. So that's a lot. And that is actually the main kind of philosophical substance. And the rest of this is a little bit about how to apply those views and how to move them forward. So the second question is, how democratic was 20th century mass media, and how democratic is our current digital public sphere? And because I know nothing about either the mass media or the digital public sphere of Chile or even Latin America generally, these remarks will be geared toward evaluating the quality of the public sphere in the North America, in the United States primarily, but I think a bunch of this also applies to Canada. Okay, the 20th century public sphere in the United States, its architecture was a one-to-many communication. There were a few people talking who were in large media organizations and professional journalists, and many, many people, the viewers and purchasers of newspapers listening. So taking stock, how democratic was that on our rights and opportunities and norms and responsibilities? First, it was not that diverse. The speakers all demographically looked the same. They were middle-aged white men. They were all educated in roughly the same universities and socialized according to the same social views about what was desirable in society and undesirable in society. And so it was high on truth regarding and common good orientation, because these journalists were actually socialized to try to get the story right, and they often did on that. However, it was pretty low on opportunities for expression. A citizen can't really find much purchase in the public sphere unless he or she was a professional journalist or politician. It was relatively low on diversity. So in the late 20th century in the United States, there wasn't much reporting on the perspectives of working people as opposed to capital and business perspectives. In the mid 20th century, reporting on the plight of African Americans and the civil rights movement came very, very late from this set of journalists. And then a pivotal part of United States public life, the mainstream media were very, very late in coming to criticisms of the United States involvement in Vietnam. And then in the early stages of the current or the recent wars, more recent wars in the Middle East, almost all of the mainstream media right after September 11th favored a US invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, both, right? So they spoke with one voice, largely, with very little dissent, right? So not that diverse. It was, in photographic analogy, a narrow aperture public sphere in which few ideas and few speakers jump through that hole. So in terms of a report card on my earlier standards of rights and opportunities and responsibilities and norms, the 20th century mass media gets a C for opportunities for expression and communicative action. It didn't do well in that regard. It gets a B in access to reliable information, because journalists were working very hard to get the story right. So important information did come out. The reporting on the Watergate crisis in the Nixon administration, for if that means anything, if you're kind of follow that, was very, very important in the history of the United States and the public sphere and access to reliable information. But it does get an A in terms of truth-seeking, common good orientation, and civility. The speakers in the 20th century public sphere very much internalized those norms as part of their professional journalistic commitment, right? So for us in our evaluation, the 20th century public sphere was a mixed bag, was a mixed story from the perspective of healthy democracy. Now, what about the 21st century digital public sphere? It has a very different architecture in the 20th century public sphere. There are hundreds of millions of speakers in large societies, all talking to one another. In the digital part of it, the role of journalists, the role of professional journalists and media organizations is still very present, but much less potent and powerful than it used to be, and much less of a gatekeeper. And the organizations have shifted from large media organizations to digital platform organizations. And so the aperture of communication, using the photographic analogy, is much, much more open than it used to be. And I think in his introductory remarks, Steve stressed diversity in terms of views out there as they've emerged in politics and society. And that's an important part of the opening of the aperture. But another part of the important part of the opening of the aperture is that the media sphere itself has much, much less of a filter. So in the mid 20th century in the United States, there were lots of people who believed crazy views and conspiracy theories. It's just that they were never really able to gain much oxygen and attention in the public sphere because the mainstream media, with its high journalistic standards and truth-seeking orientation, filtered them out. So, you know, it's not that they weren't there. There are fewer of them than now, I think, but they weren't able to gain informational attention and traction. Okay, so how does the 21st century digital public sphere do? I think it gets a C on these norms and responsibilities that many, many participants in the 21st century public sphere are not interested in truth-seeking or the common good or civility. They're using the public sphere and communicative opportunities to advance very different objectives, such as political self-interest or simply making money, or a range of interests and orientations that violate these norms and responsibilities that we regard as very important to a healthy democratic public sphere. We actually think it gets a B in terms of access to reliable information. For audiences who are trying, there's much, much more reliable information available if you're trying to get it than there was 2 decades ago, for sure, right? You can find out in many societies, you know, the very details of pandemic trends in COVID and public health data in a minute or two in a way that just would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago. Now, the trouble is there's a lot of unreliable information out there in the digital public sphere also. So there's a lot of noise, and it takes oftentimes energy and motivation and some sophistication to find the reliable information and discount the unreliable information. And then we think the digital public sphere gets actually an A with regard to some of the rights and opportunities that are important for a healthy democratic public sphere. Expressive opportunities and diversity are much more available than they were in the 20th century mass media public sphere. And communicative action. I don't know the role that social media and digitalization played in those 2 episodes that led up to the Chilean Constitutional Assembly that we see now. I imagine it was important, I just don't know. But for many other civil society movements like Occupy Wall Street or many of the movements after the financial crisis in Europe, or the Me Too movement for women's rights in the United States and elsewhere, the digital public sphere has been instrumental to enabling a very robust form of collective action and communicative action, expressing ideas and coalescing people behind those activities. Okay, so third and final part of the remarks, how can the digital public sphere be made better for democracy? Big question with, again, constitutional, political, but also civil society and private sector elements. We don't really know what the answer to that question is. I wish we did with some level of precision, but here are 3 orientations. First, look forward, not backward. The healthy, robust, democratically supportive digital public sphere will not look like the 20th century public sphere. It will have very different characteristics. And we think it's a mistake to try to recreate what was good about the 20th century in the 21st century. The second orientation is that the burden of responsibility is on citizens, not just politicians and not just companies, but also ordinary citizens and civil society. Everyone needs to do their part. and then shared action and responsibility on the part of government, on the part of citizens, but especially on the part of private sector organizations. And one thing that many of us took for granted in the 20th century mass media public sphere was the level of corporate social responsibility that some of those large news organizations had to the health of democracy. And it was for sure imperfect and partial and frequently violated. But I think the commitment of those news and media organizations in the mid 20th century in the United States, in Europe, to democracy was just much, much greater. It's not even a comparison, much, much greater than the commitment of modern internet platforms to the health of democracy. They just don't have that sense of social responsibility, and it's not articulated. It's barely present. There's pressure for it now. But one central question is how can, at minimum, legislation and politics and perhaps constitutional provisions create that responsibility of private sector actors to the health of democracy? And that's tricky. Okay, now, what kind of, just a couple of questions on the free expression side, because, you know, kind of the rubber hits the road legally in terms of policy when people ask, well, okay, you like free expression, but what kind of speech would not be allowed? We don't think that toxic behavior is really very important in our view, and there's not much objection to really creating legal provisions, policy provisions, maybe constitutional provisions to decrease toxic behavior. For instance, defamation, but then also, I don't know, for you who have followed this, there's talk on the internet of doxing, which is revealing people's private identities and addresses and family locations on the internet. And then a lot of bullying occurs as a result of that speech act. Another particularly toxic form of behavior in the United States has been swatting, where you call authorities and report someone you don't like as running a gang house or a drug house. And then in our over-police society, heavily armed police come in and raid that house, and sometimes people get killed and hurt. These kinds of acts have very little democratic value. They threaten some of the core elements of what we regard as important in a healthy public sphere, like rights, expressive opportunities, diversity, communicative action. Enforcement should be viewpoint neutral, and governments and companies, including up to the constitutional level, should act. Now, one thing I imagine that's very high on all of your minds, because it's all of us have been thinking about a lot, is what about fake news? Should we enact laws or policies or even constitutional provisions to take down, to prohibit fake news? This is a good topic for discussion, but we are very ambivalent on this point. Some platforms, such as Apple News, are formally and functionally in the news business, but so are Facebook, Twitter, and some of YouTube. We think that those actors should try to detect and demote fake news in order to protect access to reliable information, diversity, and regard for the truth. But however, the clear danger here is over-regulation, that either governments, regulators, or private sector actors will deem some views fake that actually have value in the democratic public sphere. So just as a point of, I don't know whether it's bragging or my ability to see the future, I bought my masks off of Amazon in February 2020, right? And at that point in February 2020, the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization were advising people not to buy masks because they simply don't protect you from COVID, was the official position. Now, if I had posted that information on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, right, some of people might say, oh, you should take down Archon's post because it's fake news. Look, the public health authorities in the globe in the United States have decided that he's wrong, that it's just not truth, and he's misinforming and creating a public health hazard. I disagree. I think that my dissenting opinion is a useful contribution to the public debate, even as many people would have regarded it as untruthful and fake news, right? So how do we create enough space, sufficient and robust space for that public debate? We think that governments should stay out of directly policing fake news. However, there is a role for legislation, public policy, and maybe even constitutional provisions for producing good news. Louis Brandeis, famous Supreme Court justice in the United States, said famously, if there is a time to expose discussion, the falsehood and fallacies that are out there, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. So maybe part of the cure for fake news is the amplification and promotion of good news. The bad part of the development here is that our social capacity for producing good news has dramatically decreased in the last decade and a half. And Paulina will know this, I think, intimately well. That's just the sheer number of journalists, of working journalists, is far less than it used to be, because a bunch of the advertising revenue has moved from media organizations that employ journalists to large platform organizations like Google and Facebook. And indeed, the number of newspapers and jobs in newspapers in the United States is now less than has fallen at a greater rate than the number of fishing jobs, coal mining jobs, and steel mill jobs in the United States. So everybody knows deindustrialization has changed the job structure, but digitalization has radically changed the structure of people producing reliable information. So some proposals in this area are a fact tax. That is, why not tax large private sector companies who are in the media business some percentage and pay for 100,000 more Paulinas? I would love for that to happen. Right. There are things to say about privacy and security. We think that strong privacy provisions, constitutionalized, but also in law and public policy, would advance some of these democratic values in the public sphere that we think are really, really important. And then finally, we think that there's a large role for responsible citizens in producing a healthy democratic public sphere. And that has elements that include media literacy, civic education, but also the ways that private sector platforms engage citizens in accessing and amplifying information, as well as regulatory provisions. That all of those things can encourage the people who are public sphere participants, speakers, as well as listeners and amplifiers, to abide by these norms and fulfill these responsibilities of truth-seeking, common good orientation, and civility. So that's the end of my remarks. The summary slide is just the rights and opportunities that we regard as very important, and the norms and dispositions that we regarded as very important. And these are ideals. All of our societies are very far from them, to be sure, and maybe further from them now than we were just a couple of decades ago. And the question for us all as citizens, as legislatures, as 150 people in the Chilean Constitutional Assembly, how can we act to get closer to the ideal, to create the public sphere and the informational conditions that a healthy democracy requires? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Archon. That was wonderful. Okay, nuestro primero panelista será Patricio.
So our first panelist will be Patricio Bernedo. Patricio, go ahead. Thank you very much, Steve. And very honestly, thank you for the invitation to participate in this forum and to share and spend time with people that I've known for a while, some of them, and some of them that I've had the pleasure to meet right now. And I also want to thank very particularly the presentation from Professor Fung, very inspiring, very challenging from different perspectives. And obviously it brings about a lot of questions for us. They invited me as a historian. To be here. And so, well, I have two fields that I'm working in, history and communication and economic history. And so sometimes I try to link these two fields. And here, well, I'm really going to talk more about history of media, the press, and also gathering a lot of these aspects that are applied in Chile and for Archon, so you can see maybe draw some parallels between the case in Chile and the case in the United States. But basically, they show that there are elements that are shared, that are historically have been shared, and that have been seen in a large majority of countries from the West, at least. And in this sense, first, before I'm going to talk about the history and answer the question that is kind of the title of this webinar. And I think that we have to, I'm going to have a definitive answer. I think we can have public deliberation and freedom of expression in a more inclusive society. I think we can. And I would even dare to say that to be able to have public deliberation and a more inclusive society, freedom of expression is irreplaceable. It's a fundamental pillar so that the other two elements can also be enabled. And so when I speak about freedom of expression, I'm also speaking of a number of freedoms that are part of the same family of freedoms. And they're inseparable. Some that Archie that mentioned freedom of association, for example, and they're all related with the freedom for communication, freedom of free competition, pluralism, the right to information, to be able to not have restrictions in access information to debates that are considered to be public. So now the freedom of expression, to some extent, there are limits. They're very minimal, but I think that they're enough. For example, there are certain issues with fake news that go along with this freedom of expression and the limits there. So in terms of the justification or the limits, so I could put the flow of freedom of expression at threat with some things, and even a more inclusive society if I have certain actions. So if we look at the Chilean context, historically, and it also applies to a large part of Latin America, most of the countries in Latin America, building a republic from the beginning of the 19th century, one of its fundamental pillars was precisely the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which was the first one. And even coming from Spain in the Constitution of Cadiz, that we all differentiate to a large extent with this fundamental pillar, which is the freedom of expression and speech. Even in Chile, there was a decree from 2013 where we talked about this issue, where we say that each citizen must have the right to express themselves freely, to be able to communicate their ideas. And that's fundamental to be able to fight against any type of tyranny and to have an effect over the public opinion. So now legislation that started to come about over the 19th century, the main part was always starting from the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And that was in a lot of different newspapers and in the 19th century, especially in 1840 and onwards, there were journalists and media that was opening up, and there were more and more. And they started to form a public opinion through rational and orderly debate. And there were debates that they didn't always get along with each other. There were difficult debates where they were in disagreement, but they were able to talk about current politics and the projects for the country moving towards the future, among other things. So it was quite a political and deliberative press, intellectual, that was quite elite, I have to say that, but it was able to permeate the residents and mostly literate people. So now gradually from the middle of 1850 and forward, and at the same time as what was happening with the United States at that time, in Europe and a lot of other countries in Latin America, we began to see more modern newspapers, maybe that started to form companies that were different, that were the other ones that were considered to more be pre-modern media. And so these modern media more had a company nature, enterprises, and they were starting to offer more news. They weren't just offering opinions, not just editorials, but they were offering news. And instead of being funded by subscriptions or contributions from a party or an organization, because they were expensive newspapers, they were starting to develop a company newspaper through marketing and through advertising. And that was the central fundamental aspect that allowed people to have access and economical aspect and economical access to these newspapers.
These companies have within their features, they professionalize journalism, and they get a salary for the employees, and they understand that there are political actors within their system and that they need to attract their readers for advertisement, and they need to generate earnings and surviving. And some newspapers, El Mercurio Valparaíso, and in Santiago, other newspapers at the beginning of the 20th century, El Mercurio Santiago, and other newspapers in Santiago. So as it was happening, most of the countries with the freedom of speech and press freedom, the barriers to open a new newspaper was increasing. Technology, printing, communication. It was important to have the print and distribution and marketing became more sophisticated, so more expensive for the companies. That means that before barriers, entry barriers were very low, And now, at the beginning of the 20th century, they're very complex, very difficult to fund a newspaper that can compete in a public sphere and have the audience and have support from advertisement. That also generated the fact that the political parties did, and some did, they funded their own newspapers, not so massive as the Communist Party and other parties. They have their own outlets, and this growth of the journalist companies didn't allow that other newspapers as immigrants and associations or some unions, they simply disappeared and they stayed in a small niche. And the public opinion is not highly impacted. In the 20s, we have the radio erupting, massive entertainment in the radio. In the Chilean case, it follows the North American model with editorial lines that are pluralistic and Radio Cooperativa, as you said, Steve, before, where Paula works. It's a radio station that has been structured and configured in such a way that it's a universe of radio stations that today play a transcendental role in pluralism in Chile. And the radio stations become a part of the public debate and public participation. And you can say that there are two times that are important where you lose the possibility of exercising the freedom of expression in just some months of 1891 Civil War, and then after dictatorship of Ibáñez del Campo between 1927 and 31. In this context, in the 30s, they start developing a democracy that is more stable, more participative, a democracy that integrated the middle classes and in a more direct way, participation, and that there is a political development that work together in systems in mass media and also democratic systems. They were integrating demands, greater demands, and new sectors in politics, and participation had a great increase. In that sense, the greatest incorporation in 1952 was participation of women. Late 1952 in elections, and in that period between 52 and 1970, the number of voters went from 18% of the total population of the country to 36% of the total population of the country. And finally, in 1970, they incorporate the right to vote, the illiterate. There were not many, and but they also had that right. Now, to close, at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, we see that political forces were losing their democratic convictions. Mass media were also losing their convictions, radio stations, and the news channels, they started structuring and starting in Chile. This led to a journalism that was too combatant, and also in that ended up with a coup in 73, and that ended with the freedom of press, and then had violations of human rights afterwards. And during dictatorship and exposing to censorship, exposing the persecution and even assassination, some radio stations, including Cooperativa, opposed the dictatorship, and other media, they kept working in this period that was so difficult. And then from the return to democracy in the 90s, communication media and mass media and in democracy, due to the traumatic experience, became defenders of political stability, this to guarantee democracy, defenders of freedom of speech to guarantee free debate, of the economic model to guarantee the economic growth, overcoming poverty, and that is a reformism that ended up in not moving that much and simply staying or sticking to what they already have. Now, questioning the economic model, how democratic institutionality works, a political representation system, and refoundational thoughts about in all areas. They are asking for expanding political participation. And there are also proposals to give free speech and press and develop a solid democracy in Chile. So there is a paradox here. There want a greater participation in politics. There are sectors that are also asking for greater control and restriction to freedom of speech. Thank you.
Paula Molina. Paula.
Paula Molina. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to greet everyone and those that are connected to these seminars. These are conversations that are very important to go in line with the constitutional process in Chile, and that has great depth in Chile. A journalist, I work on a daily basis as a journalist, and I would like to tell you about my work, how I do my work, and also how innovation in journalist project, how can we foster reforms and answers, and not only challenges for the mass media, but the tensions, social tensions that we are undergoing and that we are looking for an institutional response. And as Professor Levitsky was saying, and to see the gaps and the silent points in our information system. A vigorous defense of freedom of speech needs to be done with the answer to those questions against freedom of speech. And you respond to that, not with restrictions, but how you incorporate all these demands that are being felt and that are being processed in a better way. So the defense of freedom of speech, of expression, cannot be done simply out of the void. We need to see what people are telling us, what communities are telling us, and what can we offer? How can we offer the best response, the best answer, and a promise, information promise that needs to be deep and responding to the hope of the society of being more inclusive. And this is what we're facing today. It's very difficult to work as a journalist in such a transformational process, especially where I work on a daily basis, because you're telling the story, but you're trying to making sense of what you're seeing. And we are in the midst of such a large process, such a large changing process. So as we have said in Chile, we did not see what was coming. We did not see the need of change. We did not see what was coming. We did not see the demands that were coming and that we had in Pacific protests. But in many disruptive events, we are trying to process and respond to it in an institutional way in the convention. And journalism, it does not have any divination or forecasting or accurate or future projection or fortune telling. We cannot do that, but what we need to do is to see what were the gaps, what were the problems that we had, because with this uprising that we had, we were having issues on the establishment and family community in the country, in the regions. And I would like to start asking, what do we have in the information system in Chile? And as Professor Fung said, the pillars of the mass media, what were the problems? How plural our system is. And that a researcher is clear. She says, journalism in Chile is like being in a room without curtains, or with closed curtains. She corrects herself, with closed curtains. You cannot see outside. You do your work in your media, obeying to large economic groups. But that has not hindered the work of journalism of many people within the same media. But they are in closed doors, and this is a structure. We need to respond. We need to reduce the barriers of the entry to media outlets. And we have opened the windows of these rooms that we said at the beginning that had their curtains down. So we're opening the curtains. We are, and they might not have the intention of following the standards of quality that we are demanding from journalism. When the student Archon Fung sent his writings, his articles, maybe yes, they were well written. I don't review that, but I review what our writers tell us, and I question them, and it makes it a longer work, but that will guarantee the standards of quality. So I guess Argon's work it does need a recognition. Yeah, and that should allow dialogue. And maintain quality. Diversity in the Chilean media and the representation of the different voices in the country, as well as inclusion of the demand of the different sectors in the public sector. Well, what we need to do is to understand from the beginning, from the students' protests, including issues as the indebtedness level, the quality of education, and standardized tests. Educational tests would tell us that education was not good, and growing frustration in many sectors of society. How can we follow up on the process and the analysis? And that growing desperation is something we need to respond to. Many people in our press rooms, in editing, they came from municipal schools, public schools, and were able to see all those areas that were necessary. This is part of our commitment. Similar phenomena in representation of other realities. We have the feminist expressions in Chile, many women. So the media can incorporate half of the population in the public speech. And everyone knows this. Everyone that lives in Chile, they know. We have panels of opinion that only men are part of those panels. So and women are not presented as expert voices. We know women are not represented in different areas. And this has been so for a long time. And when they were able to open up those spaces, they have enriched the perspective, and they have met the purpose of collaborating into an inclusive society. We have mobilized agendas in facing violence against women and all sorts of different gender violence, visibilize the areas of care and issues that were simply absent in our orbit, in our public discourse. Similar things. In May 2021, CIPER presented the representation of the political candidates and presented this in panels in television channels. Results are concerning. Indigenous representatives, they were marginated in these debates. And 63% of the panelists were from the metropolitan region. but those from the constituent it's only 31%, and only half of those came or wanted to be part of 5 districts in the metropolitan region. And these are from the 5 highest income districts, and they were the ones that had the greatest exposure in the media. So what we need to do is to face those issues, solve these issues with freedom, also freedom of speech, and to exercise other freedom. But we also need a commitment towards open communication, diverse, inclusive, and seeing the inequalities, favoring inclusion. In the case of Chile, that lived for so many years and of restrictions of the freedom of expression, putting into risk the safety and life of the individuals, it needs to do that. It needs to have an explicit commitment towards values that were not respected before. We need to be careful with language, social prejudice, gender prejudice, stereotypes, patronizing terms that we had in the past. So we are the ones that can take responsibility of the use of language. It's not censoring or going against censoring, but we need to be aware of the terms from the mass media, and we need to know that we need to evolve with language. We have to control the impulses of restricting freedom of speech, to contain hate speech, falsity, and sexist speech. We need to be open as a society. We will not be solving this if we don't tackle those issues, recognize them, and see what are going to be our proposals to the future. This is what I wanted to share with you. And hopefully that we can open up for the space of conversation.
Ponencia será de profesora Chiara Saez.
Hola, gracias.
Hello, now the next professor, Saez. I'm going to present this presentation. First, I prepared something that was going to last about an hour, but then I had to keep on cutting off more and more to allow for the time limit. But I'm going to try, after all of these cuts that I made to it, I'm going to try to keep it in 10 minutes, but it was important to me to provide data and information. I also wanted to start with this quote from Nancy Fraser from a book from 1997. Was one of the chapters that talks about the new public sphere, and she develops this thesis a lot, that the idea that formal equality ensures a public deliberation that's really and truly democratic. And I wanted to start with this quote because basically my thesis is that in Chile, there is a problem with inequality and access to public deliberation, that in the relevant public sphere, the dominant media have restricted many people, and the majority of the media, the core of the market of the media, primarily commercial in nature, and the rest of the society has certain obstacles, barriers to be able to immerse themselves in this area. So that's a little bit of my starting point. And this has to do with 3 sources. First, the Constitution, not that the one that we're trying to change in the current process, the laws that come from the Constitution, and the interpretation and the application, the enforcement of these laws. So it's not a legal problem, it's also a cultural and historic problem. In this sense, our Constitution from 80 starts with restricting freedom of expression that focuses on a concept of formal equality that doesn't exist a collective and conservative vision of this is what we saw at the time. So currently, we have a lot of structural problems. And I just want to show a few little, touch a little bit on this problem. First of all, the authoritarian enclaves. There are various issues that affect exercising journalistic work, the right to have communication media, which applies, there is a criminal right, the application of criminal rights, criminal law, when there are uncertain freedom of expression, which is a crime of threatening the authorities, access to public information, for example. All of these issues that I'm listing here are in the Inter-American report from the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights from 2016, and LANSA did this report. There are regulations and practice that place restrictions on the right to freedom of expression and the right to access information in the country, which can be understood as being inherited from the doctrines from the past. So there's a debt that we still have that has not been able to be resolved over the last 30 years with society. There are other aspects, and an aspect that I think that is important, structural, is the autonomous bodies that captured, specifically with TVN, CNTV, and each of these channels, we see situations where there have been interventions to hinder certain contents and to stop certain decisions being made by the board. A lot of issues and sanctions related to pluralism issues or human rights. Some people are sanctioned, or they're formalized and they have charges filed against them for certain things. And sometimes they're discussing what should be the content of the secret meetings that they had with the president, and what is the greater meaning of the social uprising, for example. Then the lack of protection of informational work. And this is what we saw beginning with the social uprising and being arrested and attacks on journalists as well. Sometimes there are journalists who are independent. They don't only work for mass media organizations. And this type of journalists, these community journalists, in yellow, they had gases used against them. These are the types of attacks on the press by members of the state. So basically, there are 400 people almost who have been victims, who, as they were performing their journalistic work, they were victims of the state over the last 2 years. So then here's another data and piece of information about informational pluralism and national television. And this is the study that I've been working on for the last 2 years. Here, I'm not going to stop on this instrument right now, but we have been working on this for 2 years on a national level, specifically on news channels. You can see that in Chile, we use the grading scale from 1 to 7. And so from the 4 news channels, we have grades of around 4, which is 4 is a passing grade. But then in purple, there are opinion and debate programs. They're also within that same range of grades. And then we also have the morning talk shows as well on the list. We see that most of them barely get a passing grade. So we also included variables that have to do with the content and also the market. the relevant market of the television industry, and then the problem issue with public TV. There are two very important elements related to the national television, which is indifferentiation and self-funding. With this, in some articles about the law in public television, TVN does not differentiate between all different channels. In reports about their obligations, and the other issue of self-funding, we're the only public television in the world that has to have self-funding. And so we have to enter into the marketing and advertising market, just like commercial channels. So here's another data information about telecommunications, for example, that Paula was talking about with concentration of the property, not just about with communication media, but also with the telecommunication companies. So here, I'm really interested in the last two rows, which is where we have the data about two criteria about the concentration of the ownership, which is HHI and CR4. And CR4 is the four primary marketing companies and how much of the market share they have, and the ownership and the access to these bands, and also the content that they use and the share in the market, and the share in the 3G and 4G market. We see that the participation, the share is between 90 and 100. In some bands, only 3 companies make up for all of the access in this part of the spectrum. And just as a correlation of this, I think it's expressed very well, but you can also see it in other dimensions, is that there's a reduction in citizenship in terms of consumers. So there's a complaint with the National Agency for Consumers and Users when we were talking about the freedom of competition, and they said that they did not have legitimacy because they weren't companies, so they weren't able to complain about this market share. And the last piece of information that I wanted to present was about the relevant markets in TV. Because the problem with the market does not only have to do with property but and ownership, but also with the market of the public and with advertising. And this has to do with the news channels that are national in nature, because they're the ones that are seen the most. In Chile, culturally, the TV is a very fundamental part, just like the radio, but TV especially in prime time. And what we have, if we add everything up, all of the news is given at the same time. And as we saw before, the diversity or the pluralism of these news channels is very low, but they concentrate, they have a large percentage of the marketing and advertising and the public at that time. So you have to think, and what is the public sphere that's built with some channels that have a concentration of the relevant markets, but they're also very related amongst each other. So basically, in summary, what is that we have? On the one hand, we have a lot of cases where we have what is called in the United States SLAP, situations where people or collectives decide to not complain, to not intervene in the situation, precisely because of the cost entailed in this. On the other hand, the social uprising and social situation and the pandemic have demonstrated that on a social level, that the freedom of expression is very fragile. But here I wanted to also resume the thesis from the very beginning, which is the idea of Nancy Fraser, that specifically that multiple vulnerations and violations of freedom of expression previously identified are not being debated in hegemonic spaces of public deliberation. So they are not being considered a problem right now. We created a report about freedom of expression beginning with the social uprising. And this is an issue that is not being discussed in large mass media, basically because from a standpoint of the people who are being affected by this are not part of this reality. And they're not part of this world that the large mass media represent. So what do we need? First of all, we have to assume and recognize this problem. It's not just a legal problem, it's a cultural problem as well. We have a problem. And we're not really at a good point in time. And it's now going to be affected by other things. We're in a rather bad moment. And we have to, in one element of this improvement, supposed improvement within this constitutional frame, is that it must aspire to resolve how do we go from a formal equality to a substantive equality, to a situation of greater equity that should be translated from policies that search for a rebalance for a more authentically inclusive public space, and that absolutely requires, and we would say that maybe this is the point that is very important, because this is what is really going to hurt right now. That's going to really hurt the structure, so to speak, is that we need a deconcentration of power surrounding this issue of freedom of expression. I hope that I spoke within the time that you had given me to speak, and thank you very much.
You did. Thank you. We have Francisco Urbina, professor. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conversation. It's very interesting, stimulating, and quite in line with the situation that we are living in Chile. It gives us the opportunity to discuss so many issues and that in normal situations we wouldn't even discuss or we wouldn't think about. And it is great to have such an opportunity. As a constitutionalist attorney, I would like to talk about two things in my area. First, constitutional system in Chile. There are some concepts that we need to have in mind, and then a brief reflection on standards on freedom of speech and how they, or the fact that freedom of speech is seen in communication of the 21st century, as the professor was talking about, freedom of speech and deliberation in an inclusive society. I agree with what Professor Bernedo was saying. And without freedom of expression, we do not have deliberation, we don't have democracy, we don't have decision-making without a robust freedom of speech. We don't have that, and that is related to some of the aspects, peculiar aspects that we have in the constitutional Chilean system. This is something we need to come out of, and I would like to talk about this with the same spirit as Professor Saez was talking about. Constitutional subject, it's not did not start from a good stand, from a good point. We started from a bad point, in fact, and we can go back. So what is the bad thing about this condition? Well, freedom of expression, freedom of speech and efficiencies, and freedom of expression, but we have a constitutional issue that is being brought for decades. This is not a social crisis that just started October 18, 2019, but it is something that it refers to legitimacy of the Constitution. It's not fully legitimate. So it will operate as a constitution, and that is a specific problem at Chile. There are no other regimes that are referenced for us, and there is a great discussion in constitutional problem. What is the magnitude of legitimacy? Where does it come from? And constitution of a democratic constitution. But there is an element that is very important diagnosed. And it is something that has been discussed. And it's the idea that the Chilean constitution is not fully impartial. Some are talking about traps. It favors a political position. Some people say that this can be discussed in the magnitude of before the reforms of 2005. And today, I think it's something that picks up the reality of our constitutional system in a certain way, and it implies the lack of capacity of recognizing the different political positions. And we can't go in detail on how this operates in practical terms, but the result of that is that constitution is part of the partisan political debate. Some for certain debates with certain periodicity, attribution of the consumer national service to regulate the abuse of these are issues that are part of our political debate, and it divides the political position regarding this to the right or the left, and that is aligned in certain polls in certain areas. And this is part of the debate, of the Chilean debate in the last decades. So that is something that leads to a conclusion that is very important. Thinking about the constitutional change. It has to overcome this. It needs to generate an impartial constitution, and that applies to the issue of freedom of speech. It's crucial to preserve the capacity of the institutional system, expressing different visions, and it's important for the Constitution to be impartial in the different positions and maintain bring in all the diverse political groups. And that implies that with the independently from the restrictions that there are freedom of expression, certainly there shouldn't be restrictions that affect discussion, political discussion. And the difference is that in Chile are part of the political conflict, because that would lead us to the same problem as the constitution of the 80s. And this constitution should have that. And that is related to what Jamal Green, How Rights Went Wrong, in his book, published in the United States, but applies to Chile. And that is the challenge, constitutional challenge, that different tries to, characterize the differences that we have, different opinions. And the task of constitution is allowing to have all the visions of all the groups in society, and they should feel reflected, reproduced, and they have to be reflected there. It's an important function. That as a background, and now let's bring it to freedom of expression. connected to freedom of expression in the 21st century. That has to do with new ways of expression, new challenges. And there's a first point affecting the debate, and we should not hinder the possibility of expressing the political views and the political feelings and the respect to traditional demands on human rights. And there are some questions about that. I'm thinking about standards of the prohibition of pre-censorship, and that is being presented to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. All fundamental rights need to meet objective of being adequate, necessary, and proportionate. And in freedom of expression, that could be expressed with greater or lesser vigor. If it's something that is affecting public interest, we need to see the relative standards on the use of criminal law and also in human rights. Third point, the legality, satisfying the standards on precision, clarity, coherence, and some of the concerns, well, they're reasonable. And in this situation, we see some questions. How do we understand the previous censorship? How do we understand that in freedom of expression? How we articulate this in phenomena, as Professor just said, as with doxing and the publication of private images, but it's very difficult to remediate that. But for example, images that are not supposed to be taken to the network, and also the possibility use of power. And also the legislation, Nicaraguan legislation on fake news, and it also on human rights issues. And Professor Fung mentioned that is excluding the state or the government from the definition of fake news, and to avoid certain abuse and restrictions. Also standards of expression and new areas, the areas of access to information, trustworthy information. This is something that is constitutionalized. And there is another issue that has to do with digital literacy. Digital literacy, and to see that there is trustworthy information and there is a greater role. And this is marginal, and this is priority. And that has to do with old standards related to that. Another additional question, what are the platforms? The platforms and a state that regulates, and also the distinction of what's total, what is not total, what is civil society, and that implies greater difference or restrictions, and standards, and respecting freedom. And the platforms, they have an intermediate position. And another element things as fake news or toxic issues, well, the evaluation and they are crossed by the political debate. And what is toxic? Well, we have to see where are we located politically and being biased about that. And they cannot simply close the political debate. And in the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, there is a dialogue, and there is a dialogue, digital platforms. And that shows that, well, these problems are new, there are no solutions made. And a brief conclusion. Constitution can recognize freedom of expression, and it's robust, and they're subject to strict standards. And this is part of the democratic dialogue. And that is important to point out. Thank you for the invitation, and I will be open for questions. Thank you, Professor. Thanks to the poor time management that we had, we ran out of time. And we're not having much time for questions. And what we want to do is to thank Patricio, Archon, Fung, Francisco Molina for their, and each and everyone, Chiara, Saez, everyone, and Patricio, Bernedo. Thank you so much on behalf of Dr. Glass. Thank you.